In this video, we'll demonstrate how to go through the steps for the second machine project, which is the eyeglass case. This is the pattern and the instructions all in one. The first thing that you need to do, as it says in step 1, is to cut the pattern out. And you'll see that there are two sets of lines, a solid line and a dashed line. The solid line represents the cutting line. The dashed line represents the stitching line. So you can see there's going to be about 1/4 inch seam allowance space from the outside edge to where you'll sew. This pattern does have notches as well as dots, and so if you have done your pattern lessons, which you need to complete before you start this project, you know that these tell us where one piece will be matched to another piece, and these will also match to another piece, but in addition to that, a dot usually indicates a place where you need to stop or start sewing. So you can see between the two here, there will be an opening when we stitch this. So the first thing we need to do is cut out the pattern, and we're going to be sure to cut on the solid line, not the broken line. There is an area here where the cutting line was cut off by the photocopy, but you just maintain that 1/4 inch seam allowance and it will be no problem. When you get to the notches, you need to be sure to remember that we do not cut the notches off and we do not cut them inward into the seam allowance. We cut out around notches. So like this. That way we see this little piece of fabric sticking out from the edge, even if we don't mark the pattern symbols or we don't have the pattern still pinned to the fabric. It's very easy to see where these little pieces of fabric will stick out and remind us that that's where our notches are. Okay, so we have our pattern all cut out. The next step is to cut this same pattern out of 2 pieces of fabric and 1 piece of quilt batting. So there are a number of ways that you can do this. One option is to lay out your 2 pieces of fabric, and remember that our fabric should be flat. So if you were doing something larger, you would definitely need to iron this fabric before you started. But because this is relatively small, we'll be able to just stretch it flat and pin it down. It will be no problem. So we could pin or trace this pattern onto the fabric and cut it out 1 layer at a time, or we could take our 2 fabrics, lay them out together, and cut everything at once. You can use 2 different fabrics if you would like your finished case to have a different color lining than it does on the outside, or you can just use 1 fabric and make 2 layers. If I was going to use this fabric and I need 2 pieces of it, or if I was using any 2 fabrics that have a definite right side and wrong side, remember the right side is the colored or pattern side, the wrong side is the inside or what you wouldn't want to show when you're finished. So if I was cutting 2 pieces at the same time using a patterned fabric, with a definite right side, I would want to layer the fabric so that the right sides, the patterned or colored sides, are touching each other, right sides together, just as we would want them when we sew, before I lay down my pattern and pin or trace to cut these out. Now the reason for this is when we're finished, our directions will tell us to lay the fabric out right sides together, and you see place right sides of fabric together and batting below. Because this is not a symmetrical shape and it has this little piece that comes out here, if I were to cut one and then another, so now let's imagine I have one here that I've cut out. Now, if this was my second one and I wanted to place it right sides together, you can see the problem. Now, this piece is on the left of my top, but like we said before, it would have been on the right over here. Now, if we make sure the fabric is right sides together before we cut it out, then we know for sure that these will match up when the fabric is right sides together because they were matched when we cut them in the first place. If you cut your two pieces separately and you have a fabric with a right side, just be sure to cut one of the pieces with the right side up and one of the pieces with the right side down, and then they will match up when you have to line them up. One other thing when you're cutting out of fabric, don't get caught doing the thing where you cut out of the middle. Try to fold so that you're using as little of the fabric as possible. If we folded this completely in half, okay, and I cut this out here, when I open my fabric up, I'm gonna have two holes right here in the middle of my fabric. That might make it difficult for this fabric to be used for a larger project. That hole could end up right in the middle of where you need for something else. So it's much better to cut as close to a corner or edge as you can always. So we're gonna put our two fabrics together. We're going to lay our pattern piece on top. We're going to be sure to smooth out any wrinkles. And then just as you saw in your lesson for this week on pinning pattern pieces, our pins are going to go within the boundaries of the pattern piece. They're going to be fully inside. They're going to go all the way down and all the way back up again. So we have our layers pinned, both of our pieces of fabric, and now we're ready to cut out our pattern. We're keeping everything flat as we cut. This will help make sure it's accurate. You'll also notice I'm using fabric shears to cut out the fabric, but when I cut out the pattern piece, I used paper scissors. In class, the ones with the tape means that they've gotten too dull to be effective on fabric, and we've relegated them to scissors. At home, you would know which ones are for what. Just like before, when we come to the notches, we need to cut out around to be sure we have them there as our little reminder. So we have our 2 pattern pieces. Then we need to cut 1 layer of quilt batting. Now, if you don't have quilt batting and you're a fully remote student, let me know. We can make sure we have some for you to pick up. This comes in big sheets. This is what we use on the inside of our quilts to make them fluffy and thick. So, we're going to cut the same shape from the quilt batting. You won't really be able to cut out around the notches. We have our 2 pieces of fabric and our piece of quilt batting. And as the directions tell us, we're going to place the right sides of the fabric together with the batting below. So we're making a layered stack. When you do this, you might be tempted to think that you should put the batting between the layers. However, once this is sewn and you go to turn it right side out, either way, the batting will be on the outside of the project. This is why the directions tell you to put the 2 layers of fabric together. And again, remember, we want right side up on the first piece, right side down on the second piece, but this fabric doesn't have a specific right side, so we don't have to worry about that. Okay? This way, when we turn it right side out, we'll have fabric on both the outsides, and this will end up on the inside. So now, we're going to pin this in preparation for sewing. Again, from your pinning lesson that was for this week, when we pin to sew, our pins are always going to point toward the inside. This is going to help so we don't poke ourselves. And again, the pins should go all the way down through all the layers and back up again. And you'll notice I am putting these pins perpendicular to my seam. So I'm going to be sewing this way, so my pins are going this way. If you've placed your pins straight, this will allow you to actually sew over your pins. As long as you're going fairly slowly, you can usually do that. So we have our 2 dots here. We want to put a pin to represent the position of each dot. It doesn't have to be perfect, but this is going to remind us where to leave the opening. We have this all pinned. You'll notice my pins are on top because when I sew, I'm going to have the batting on the bottom. I don't want my presser foot to catch in the batting as I sew, and the pins should always be on top when you're sewing. So we're going to get the machine set up, and then we will sew these layers together. So we have our machine all set up. I've tested it. I know that it's sewing correctly. I'm not going to be worried about anything ruining my project that I have to take apart. So be sure to test your machine first. I have just a regular foot here. And so these are my 2 pins that I placed to remind myself where the dots would be. So that's where I'm going to start. Again, this project uses a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if your needle position is in the center and the fabric just comes to the outside edge of the presser foot, you'll be sewing about 1/4 of an inch from the outside edge. And as always, once we start, we're going to backstitch, and then we'll continue all the way around the outside, pivoting on the corners the way that we've learned to do, and we won't stop until we come back to the pin on the other side of the opening. Okay, so we've sewn all the way around. We're going to cut the thread. Here, number 4, we need to trim the corners. We're cutting off the extra bulk at a diagonal, just like we did with the pincushions. That's going to help us be able to turn the corners out squarely. So remember, when you cut your corners off, you want to be very careful that you're not going to cut your actual stitches. If you have any other bulk where there was too much fabric, too much batting, you can trim that. After you've trimmed all the corners, there's one more place we're going to trim, and that is here in this 90-degree angle. We're going to cut straight in toward the corner as close as we can, but of course not cutting our thread. This is going to allow the fabric to bend the opposite direction when we turn this right side out. So we have this all cut, all sewn. It's time to turn it right side out. So we're going to go between the 2 layers of fabric and push this out just as if you were turning a pant leg or a sock right side out. And then you may have to work it a little bit to get it back to the right shape. Where your corners are, you're going to want to poke those out nice and square. If you can't do that just with your fingertip, you can use the eraser end of a pencil. And there we have the whole thing. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is revisit your favorite stitch, the invisible stitch. That's how we're going to close this opening that we've left. I'm going to fold the edges in, and then I'm just going to put a couple of pins to hold this closed neatly for me. So we have the side opening neatly closed. Now we fold this over, and again I'm going to put some pins just to hold this the way that I want it, particularly because if you're careful to fold the lining into the seam, and you stitch very closely to the edge when you do this next step, which is called top stitching. This will look really good, very neat. But if you sew too far from the edge, or you roll these side seams, you get sort of poofing and gapping that doesn't look as nice. So to top stitch, we're going to back stitch, sew as close as we can to the edge, and back stitch here. This is very thick. We have our layers of fabric as well as their seam allowances and the batting. So it is possible that your needle will have a difficult time getting through this, or you may have a difficult time getting started. It's hard to say whether it will be easier to start from here or here. This tends to be the most successful. For this step, whatever color thread you're using will show. So you do want to use a thread that coordinates. So we may have to tug this a bit to get it started because of the thickness. And then of course we want to back stitch. And we're going to go very close to the edge. If the fabric starts to bunch up when you come to a pin, just take the pin out. There's a lot of thickness at the corner, so using your hand wheel may be a very good option here. And again, you may have to tug this a little at the corner to get it to keep going. And then backstitch. This is essentially finished. The last step is the new skill for this project, which is the buttonhole. And the buttonhole is going to be stitched here. The button will be hand sewn to the pouch. And so this is the part where we need to talk about the steps involved in making a buttonhole. Every machine is different when it comes to the buttonhole feature. So if you use your own machine at home and you do not have a school machine, you may find that what you have to do for a buttonhole is a slightly different process. And if that's the case, you're going to want to check the manual or ask someone in your family who uses the machine if they know the process. So we need a buttonhole foot or a buttonholer. This machine does not have anything in its compartment, but the machines that people took home do all have a buttonholer in them. It looks like this. Again, it's different for every different type of machine, different brands, different models. So we're going to drop the presser foot off. We're going to put this presser foot in, but be sure that this part that slides goes in the back, Typically, to make a buttonhole, we would measure the length of the button and the width of the button. So obviously, if you have a much bigger button, you need a much bigger buttonhole. This particular buttonholer, the reason for this sliding piece is that you can put the button in it and then it will automatically size the buttonhole correctly. So we're going to put this back. And now we have to change some settings on the machine. Now on this machine, you can see here, number 1 is the buttonhole setting. So we need to change our stitch selector to 1. And then we're going to turn our stitch length to F for function, which is buttonhole function. So our stitch width is going to be on the widest setting, which is 5. So we're going to do a practice buttonhole so that you can see how this works. Now, we have a silver tab here that we need to pull down. You can see the buttonhole symbol on it, so this is for the buttonhole. And we always need to push this back, and then you simply push the foot pedal and it's made the buttonhole for us. So we would want to check if this is large enough for our button. If it's not, we can move that slider a little bit more. But essentially, this does everything for you. Some machines you have to change from one step to another and you have to mark the length of the buttonhole, but these ones are automatic. So as long as you remember to pull this metal tab down and push it back, this will tack the front of the buttonhole, then it will go in reverse and do the left side, then it will tack the back, and then it will come forward on the right side. Sometimes it might need just a slight tug for the forward portion. Sometimes it just gets a little caught up. Okay? So, I'm going to make it a little bigger because it looks to me like my buttonhole is, my button is thick. So my buttonhole might need to be slightly longer. But now I can do the buttonhole on my project. I want to make sure my presser foot is centered. And I may have to guide this just a little more than I did on my sample because it's so much thicker. It's more likely to get a little bit stuck. There are two ways we can open this buttonhole. One is very carefully with a seam ripper, poke it in and poke it back out again a little bit further, and then push, and you'll open it little by little. It's ideal to open it a little less than the whole length at first and check your button. That way you'll know if it's going to fit. If you are hybrid and so that you can come into school to do your buttonhole, I do have this buttonhole cutter. It's specifically for this purpose. It's a little chisel. It's very sharp, and you just place that in the opening and use it to cut your buttonhole. Then you check to see if your button can go through easily. This one is not, so we know we need to cut it just a little bigger. We're not cutting more than where the threads are, but like I said, at first we didn't cut quite all the way to the extremes of the buttonhole, just so we didn't make it too big to start with. And we're going to make it just a little bigger. Okay, perfect. So the last step is to sew on the button itself. So we're going to fold this over and mark here with a fabric pencil, or tailor's chalk. I'm going to use a pin, and that will help me know right where my button needs to go. There are a couple of different types of buttons. If your button has 4 holes, you're going to want to do either 2 horizontal lines of stitching or 2 vertical lines of stitching or an X. Don't get carried away doing every possible combination and direction, because it will just look messy. So either 2 lines this way, 2 lines this way, or an X. You've only got one option with a 2-hole button, back and forth between the 2 holes. And then this button has a shank. It's kind of difficult to see, but you can see it right there in the middle. So you just go through that loop. Some buttons have a plastic shank, some have a metal one, some stick out a little more. If your button has anything that sticks out or pokes out, you might need a wider buttonhole, a longer buttonhole. So all of those things can affect how you're going to put your button on. So we're going to take our hand sewing needle, and it's threaded. Now, up until now, I've always said that you should only knot one end of your thread and leave the other end free. Hand sewing a button is the exception, because you need so many layers of thread to keep the button secure. It's perfectly acceptable to double up your thread so you don't have to make as many passes. So I'm going to come up where I put that pin, and I'm only going through this layer of the pouch. I don't want to accidentally go through all the way to the back and sew my pouch shut. So I'm going to pull my thread through. I'm going to thread my needle through my button. And then I'm going to put my needle back through where it came out. Again, only going through this layer. And then I'll just do that a couple more times. And now I'm going to come up through the fabric, but not through the button. And I'm just going to wind my thread around 3 or 4 times. This is just going to help secure all that thread that's back there. Then I'll poke back through. I'm going to go through one of my stitches and through my loop, the same way I've tied off my other hand sewing. And if I were doing this myself, I would probably use a darker thread that wouldn't show, but I want you to be able to see the stitches. So then you just cut your extra. Your button is all sewn on and finished. Again, if you are a hybrid student, if you finish this at home, you'll need to bring it in for grading. If you are a fully remote student, please send your pouch into school or take several pictures from every angle and every direction of every piece, especially your buttonhole, your button, all of your edges, so that I can evaluate it completely. Good luck!